Thank you very much, Barry, for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this rather boring technical topic. But let me take you back a little bit in time to 1951. This is Alan Turing, as you know. Alan Turing wrote in 1950 one of the seminal papers of artificial intelligence, the one that introduced the Turing test that predicted
Like never before, our world is changing. Faced with some of our most critical challenges, human ingenuity triumphs. Today, the Microsoft AI for Good initiative enables a person with an idea to accelerate it, to give it scale, to create change for the better.
Microsoft AI will help our work by empowering people to take action.
Through AI for Earth, photos can now help save a species. With AI for accessibility, the visual world becomes an audible experience.
Sanitarium peanut butter.
And with AI for humanitarian action, first responders can target their efforts faster than ever before.
It feels humbling to know that I'm actually helping another human being.
Today, we are empowering others to forge new paths, to fight famine before a crisis strikes, and protect ecosystems by identifying forests down to a single tree.
We have the forest that we have today. We can't change that. What we can change is the future.
Microsoft AI is fueling some of the most passionate and creative people on our planet, with the help of citizen scientists, to make change, once thought impossible, real.
AI will know and understand and model based on the child interaction.
AI unleashes new possibilities to impact our world. And together, we're not just dreaming it, we're doing it.
Good afternoon, everybody. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the very first technical session of the European Conference on AI 2020. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Stuart Russell. So Stuart needs no introduction, but let me remind you of his impact and his track record. So Stuart is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the holder of the Smith Zeta Chair in Engineering and the director for the Center for Human Compatible AI. He has served as an adjunct professor at the neurological surgery at UC San Francisco and as vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on AI and Robotics. He's recipient of the Presidential Young Investigator Award of the National Science Foundation. He received the ECAI Computers and Thought Award, the World's Technology Award, the Mitchell Prize of the American Statistical Association, the Feigenbaum Prize of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, AAAI, Outstanding Educator Awards from the ACM and from AAAI, and the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. He is an Honorary Fellow of Wadham College in Oxford, Distinguished Fellow of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, Associate Fellow of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House, Fellow of AAAI, ACM, AAAS. He held the Chair Blaise Pascal in Paris from 2012 to 2014. Many of us know him through his textbook with Peter Norvig, Artificial Intelligence: A Modern Approach. It's the standard text in AI. It has been translated into 14 languages and is used in over 1,400 universities in 129 countries. His research covers a wide range of topics in AI, including machine learning, probabilistic reasoning, knowledge representation, planning, real-time decision-making, multi-target tracking, computer vision, computational physiology, and philosophical foundations. He also works with the United Nations, developing a global seismic monitoring system for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. His current concerns include the threat of autonomous weapons and the long-term future of AI and its relationship with humanity. And this is a topic that is the subject of his recent book, Human Compatible AI, The Problem of Control, which was published in 2019 by Viking Penguin. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Stuart Russell, who undoubtedly will give a fascinating talk to us. Welcome, Stuart.
Hello, thank you very much, Barry, for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this rather boring technical topic. But let me take you back a little bit in time. to 1951. This is Alan Turing, as you know. Alan Turing wrote in 1950 one of the seminal papers of artificial intelligence, the one that introduced the Turing test, that predicted that machine learning would be the best way to build AI systems, et cetera, et cetera. So fewer people know that in 1951 he gave a talk on the radio in which he said the following: "It seems probable that once the machine," I'm not very good at the accent, "that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control." So that's actually a pretty pessimistic forecast. He doesn't offer any mitigation. This is really presented in a spirit of resignation almost. So what I'm going to talk about is, why is he saying this? Is he right? And can we fix the problem? So let me take you now forward to almost the present day, where, of course, there's lots of excitement happening in artificial intelligence. Deep learning is producing breakthrough after breakthrough. And here's one of those breakthroughs. This is from OpenAI, and they use deep reinforcement learning to train these two humanoid robots to play soccer. And as you can see, the blue guy has been trained with the reward of scoring goals, and the red guy has been trained with the reward of preventing the scoring of goals. And what's particularly impressive about this is not the agility or the brilliance of the soccer playing, but the fact that a few hours before, these robots were less capable than newborn babies. They had absolutely no motor control coordination whatsoever. All they could do was lie on the ground and shiver like jellies. And within a few hours, they learned to sit up, to stand up, to move about, to find the ball, to kick the ball, to stop the ball from going in, and so on. And of course, if a human baby, a few hours after it was born, was playing soccer in the back garden with his brother, you would be quite nervous about that. So this was one of the episodes in recent years that people that were on the verge of some major breakthrough was real artificial intelligence. But some of my students, Adam Gleave in particular, were a little skeptical, and they thought, okay, could we train the red beeper a little better? Could we stopping from goals? So what we did was blue program, change the red program. The blue program is still the same controller for the robot, but now the red program is going to do something a little bit different. So here's the program. Waggles around a bit. And now the same program is completely unable to play the game at all. It seems to have known what it's all about. Sometimes he gets the ball. A lot of the time he never even manages to kick it. So here he falls over. And this happens until actually they were not we thought doing. And we're seeing similar things happening now in computer vision, where what we thought was an object recognizer, recognizing the dog, for example, is actually looking at the grass and using the grass as the identifier for what kind of dog this is. So in fact, we've been over-interpreting progress in deep learning, possibly quite easily. So that's one data point. But there are other branches of AI besides deep learning. And here's a quote from one of the leading proponents of deep learning, Francois Chollet. He said, many more applications are completely out of reach for current techniques, even given vast amounts of annotated data. And in fact, the main directions in which I see promise are models closer to general purpose computer programs. So Francois is the author of a very well-known deep learning textbook, and in some ways actually even faster than a few years ago. And he's pointing to a technology that in fact has been around for more than 20 years, and that's probabilistic programming. So, or PPL, probabilistic programming, and this is just a little fight for those of you who are not familiar with this field. And it's grown from essentially 1 or 2 papers a year up until 2008 to now more than 2,000 papers a year as of 2019. So it's growing in some ways actually even faster than deep learning grew a few years ago. So we have deep learning, we have probabilistic programming, there may be other new methods coming along. We can't say exactly when we're going to achieve the goals of artificial intelligence, but I think we can say fairly confidently that AI systems will eventually make decisions than humans in the real world. The alternative is really to say, well, we've just reached some completely insuperable obstacle and we batter our heads against it for decades and decades and decades, and we fail and we give up. And AI comes to an end. Both of these are logically possible, but most people who are working in the field believe that the first is more likely than the second. And this leads to Turing's point. If we're going to create systems that can make better decisions than us in the real world, those systems will be more powerful. It's our intelligence that gives us power over the world. If we create entities that are more powerful than ourselves, how do we control those entities and how do we do it forever? We can't just ignore this question. Let me give you an analogy. Suppose that instead of superintelligent AI coming down the pipe in 30 to 50 years, it was in fact a superior alien civilization. And maybe they even send us an email just to warn us that they're going to come in 30 to 50 years' time. So imagine this email arrives at the United Nations, and the United Nations replies with the following. Out of the office, contact. Humanity is currently out of the office. We will respond to your message when you return. They might even add a little smiley face. I mean, that doesn't seem like a plausible response from the human race to the potential arrival of a superior alien civilization in 30 to 50 years' time. But roughly speaking, that's the response of the human race to the prospect that superior machine intelligence will arrive in 30 to 50 years' time. And what I'm arguing is, in fact, this is not an adequate response. We need to figure out how to solve the problem of control. So let's try now to understand how do we lose control. And to understand that, we have to look at the standard model for AI systems. So what is the standard model? Basically, in the standard model, the human writes down an objective. And here I've written down the standard reinforcement learning objective, the infinite discounted sum of rewards. This objective is supplied to the machine in some form, and the machine says, okay, righty-ho, I will maximize that for you. And this standard model is ubiquitous, not just in AI, but also in control theory, where you're minimizing a cost function, in statistics, where you're minimizing a loss function, in operations research, where you're maximizing rewards, in economics, where you're maximizing utility or welfare. And what I'm arguing is, in fact, that the standard model is the source of the problem. It is the source of the control problem that Alan Turing referred to. The reason why things go wrong, we've actually known for thousands of years. And that's why I call this the King Midas problem. We cannot specify the reward function correctly for the real world. And King Midas had this problem. He said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. That was the objective. And rather than there being a robot, the gods happened to hear this and gave him exactly what he asked for. And then, of course, his food and his drink and his family turned to gold, and he dies in misery and starvation. So the problem is we give an objective to extremely capable machines, and they carry out the objective that we give them. And if we specify it incorrectly, which I would argue is inevitable, then we're effectively setting up a chess match between us and superior machine intelligence. And we know what happens when humans play chess against machines. We lose. And in fact, the smarter the AI system with an incorrectly specified objective, the worse the outcome is going to be, because the AI system can make more of a mess of the world in order to optimize the objective that we give it. So to convince you that this is not just a problem far off in the future, let's look at how social media operates. So very crudely, and this is maybe less true now, but certainly true earlier on, the algorithms that select content for people to view, to listen to read, which means billions of people for most of their waking lives, are trying to optimize click-through or some other kind of proxy. And to make sure that the things that are sent, the things, the articles, the videos that are selected and recommended to the user are going to be clicked on. And you might say, well, okay, fine. Then the learning algorithm is going to have to learn what people want. And surely that's better than sending them videos and articles that they don't want. But in fact, that is not how optimization works. If you know anything about reinforcement learning, you know that in order to maximize the sum of rewards, the agent takes actions that modify the state of the world. So what is the state of the world in this case? The state of the world is your brain. And so the algorithm learns to send sequences of articles that modify your brain so that in future you are more predictable and therefore will have a higher click-through rate on the content that the algorithm sends you in future. So rather than just learning what people want, it modifies people to be more predictable. And the consequences of that, I think, are perhaps already apparent and quite serious. So to recap what I've said so far, how did we get into this mess? We got into it by defining the standard model in what seems to be a very straightforward and sensible way. If you think back to the 1940s and 50s when we were formulating what AI means, we looked at human intelligence and said, okay, what does that mean in sort of concrete mathematizable terms? And we took the definition of rationality from philosophy, from economics, that humans are intelligent to the extent that our actions can be expected to achieve our objectives, whether that's goals, logical goals, as in Newell and Simon's work, or utility functions, as in operations research and later on in the work of Pearl and modern artificial intelligence. So we took that notion of what it means for a human to be intelligent, and we just transferred it directly to machines. So machines are intelligent to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And of course, once you have that definition, then you have to supply the objectives, and off the machine goes. And this is the source of the problem. This was the wrong way to formulate artificial intelligence. Instead, what we want actually are machines that are not just intelligent in their own right, but are actually beneficial to us. And that should be baked into the definition of the field. So a machine is beneficial to the extent that its actions can be expected to achieve our objectives. So here, the objectives are not necessarily in the machine at all. They are in us, and it's the machine's job to act in accordance with those objectives. It's a more difficult problem because the machine doesn't know what they are. But nonetheless, it turns out that this problem, when formulated mathematically, gives us a different way of doing AI that doesn't suffer from the control problem. So we'll call it provably beneficial AI, which almost sounds like an oxymoron, but is in fact the right way to think about it. So in deference to Asimov, we have to have three principles. The first principle is that the robot's only goal is to satisfy human preferences. And here, by preferences, I don't mean what kind of pizza you want. I mean what kind of future you want. So imagine laying out all possible futures of, comprising all the things that you as a human being might care about. And then in principle, you could rank those futures. And the robot's goal is to try to get you the future that you prefer most. The second principle is the robot does not know what human preferences are. And this uncertainty about the preferences that it's supposed to be optimizing turns out to be absolutely crucial to making machines that are safe and controllable. We also have to have a principle that connects the two things, right? The human who has the preferences and the robot who wants to figure out what they are. Information has to flow. And information flows because human behavior provides evidence of human preferences. It doesn't do so perfectly. Our behavior doesn't perfectly reflect our true underlying preferences. But nonetheless, that is the source of information about what human beings want. Of course, we all want different things, and so there are complications that I'll talk about later in terms of the variety of human preferences and the reconciliation of the preferences of multiple humans. But these basic principles lay out the approach in a nice, easily understandable way. When you formulate these principles in a mathematical framework, we call it an assistance game. So it's a game because there are both human and machine players. And it's assistance because the purpose of the robot is to assist the human, to help the human realize the preferences they have about the future. So it's a kind of a binary approach to AI rather than what we previously had, which was a unary approach, where once the machine has the objective, the human becomes irrelevant because the machine knows what it is that needs to be done. Now, with this approach, unlike the standard model, the more capable the AI system, the better the outcome. It's going to be better at learning what preferences you have, and it's going to be better at helping you achieve them. So here's the basic setup, the assistance game. You've got a human being on the left, I think, and a robot on the right. There are some references at the bottom to all the technical papers that provide the backup for this. So the human being has some preferences, we'll call that theta, just some generalized variable theta. And we assume that the human acts roughly according to theta, and then the robot has the purpose of maximizing this theta, but doesn't know what it is. And in the simple Bayesian game formulation, the robot has a prior p of theta over what the human preferences might be. So when you solve that, so you just set it up as a game and you find the solutions of the game according to some appropriate solution concept. You look at the equilibria and you see that in the equilibria, the human half of the solution is motivated to teach the robot about their preferences, not just to act in accordance with theta in a simple-minded sense, but some of those actions actually involve teaching theta to the robot, if that's possible. And then the robot half of the solution involves learning about the preferences, interpreting human actions in the light of what preferences the human might have, asking questions about human preferences. Do you like this? Is it okay if I do that? So asking permission, deferring to the human. So then part of the solution of the game is that when the human says stop, the machine will stop, because that instruction is conveying additional information about preferences that allows the robot to deduce that it really ought to stop, and therefore it does. And in the extreme case, the robot will allow itself to be switched off, which is, if you like, the kernel of the control problem. If you can't switch the AI system off, then it's game over. So for those of you who already know about inverse reinforcement learning, there is a close connection between assistance games and inverse reinforcement learning, but really this is a two-way generalization of that problem, because we have to allow for the human to be part of the problem, right, to be part of the game, which then causes the human actions to be different from the ones they would normally have if the robot weren't watching. And so standard inverse RL doesn't assume that, and therefore it wouldn't be able to interpret human behavior correctly. So with this new model, we then realize that if you open the AI textbook, you find that all the chapters of the textbook assume the standard model. They all assume a fixed, known objective or goal or loss function or reward function. So search has both a cost function and a goal. Constraint satisfaction has a goal of satisfying all the constraints, possibly with some cost function added. Planning has goals. MDPs have rewards. Supervised learning has loss functions. Reinforcement learning has reward functions, and so on. So all of these chapters, unfortunately, have to be rewritten on this broader foundation. So the old standard model is just a special case where there is perfect knowledge of the objective. Just as, search problems are a special case of MDPs where there is perfect knowledge of the outcome of every action. So let me take you through a few examples just to get a feeling for what this means. So image classification is possibly one of the simplest kinds of machine learning, very paradigmatic example of machine learning. And what you do in supervised learning is you minimize a loss function, or you minimize the expected loss by analyzing the training data. And in the full formulation of supervised learning, the loss function for classification is defined by a loss matrix, which says, what's the cost of misclassifying an object of type A as an object of type B? Now, it turns out that in almost every application of machine learning and image classification, that loss function is assumed to be uniform. So every error that you make is equally expensive. And that makes sense for competitions where that's how the algorithm is ranked. In the real world, it leads to things like accidentally classifying a human being as a gorilla, which happened to Google Photo a few years ago, and then spending millions of dollars fixing the PR disaster that resulted from that accidental classification. So clearly, the uniform loss matrix is incorrect. Now, there's about 20,000 categories in ImageNet. So that means the loss matrix has about 400 million entries. And it's not even symmetric. So there really are 400 million entries. Does anyone know what those are? Does Google know what those are? No. So you have to approach this problem knowing that you don't know what the loss matrix is. So you have uncertainty about the objective. And when you build a learning algorithm on that basis, it's going to have quite different properties. So first of all, you probably need to figure out some prior distribution over that loss matrix, which would then be a 400 million dimensional distribution. So we would need a whole new theory for how to structure those distributions so that they're manageable, so that you can estimate them from a relatively small number of examples of costs or relative costs of classification errors. If you had such a prior, then you might be able to decide that it's fine to classify some examples. For others, you're better off saying, I really don't know what this image is, and I'm going to go back to the designer and perhaps ask for some more information about the relative costs of making different kinds of errors. So you have a very different workflow, different methodology, and a new subdiscipline within supervised learning of how to do this properly. Let's take another example. The classic fetch the coffee goal that everyone gives to their mobile robot once they get it in the lab. So if you ask, okay, is fetch the coffee the objective? Clearly the answer is no, right? You don't want the robot to murder everybody in Starbucks just to get the coffee faster, or to make sure that they don't steal the coffee on the way back. You don't want to spend 1,000 euros flying to the nearest coffee shop if you happen to be a long way away from a place that has coffee. So what does the request fetch some coffee actually mean? And if the robot has so much uncertainty about other things, so now it maybe knows that you want some coffee, but what about all the rest, right? What about the right to life of other Starbucks customers? What about costs? What about other changes the robot might make to the world? So one reasonable interpretation for what fetch some coffee means comes from a paper by Wellman and Doyle, actually in the previous millennium. And roughly what it means is that all other things being equal, so ceteris paribus, having the coffee is better than not having the coffee. So the instruction doesn't say it's okay to kill people in Starbucks. It doesn't say much about how much you should be willing to spend to get the coffee. It just tells you, ceteris paribus, I would rather have some coffee. Okay? And what that leads to is the idea that the less the robot knows about human preferences, the less invasive its behavior is going to be. Because the robot should not mess with attributes of the world whose value it doesn't know. And so you get this idea of minimally invasive behavior as a natural consequence of formulating problems in this way. An even more extreme case is where the robot has no information about preferences whatsoever. But even in that case, there are still things the robot can do that are beneficial to human beings. And one of those things is to take actions whose effect is to expand the set of options for the human being. So, for example, reminding you of your password enables you to do a bunch of things that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do if you've forgotten your password. And therefore, that can be a beneficial action in the absence of any other information about your preferences. It's also possible, in fact, to infer preferences directly from just observing the state of the world. So in the early years of the 20th century, this idea of the naturalistic fallacy was popular in philosophy. Naturalistic fallacy being the fallacy that by observing the state of nature, you can infer, and typically in those days it was the preferences of the deity. What does God want human beings to do, or how does God want people to behave? And then you know those kinds of arguments. Well, if blah, 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 then God wouldn't have done this, and so you shouldn't be doing that. And this was often called the naturalistic fallacy, that in fact, you can't infer moral truths from observing natural facts. So when I say that we can infer human preferences from observing just the state of the world, that sounds like the naturalistic fallacy. But in fact, it's not, because first of all, the state of the world is not natural. The state of the world is the result of human behavior, or at least partly the result of human behavior. So it's non-naturalistic, and it's not a fallacy because the effects of human behavior on the world provide evidence about our preferences, because we chose to act in that way because of our preferences. And so simply from observing the state, you can infer back what were the preferences of the agents that produced a world state of this form. So the mathematical formulation, you can think of it as sampling from a stationary distribution. And then you figure out, okay, if this is a sample from a stationary distribution, what was the policy of the agents that produced this stationary distribution, and therefore what were their preferences? So that's a very interesting and enlightening observation from a paper by my student Rohin Shah. Let me give you a more detailed examples. We call this the paperclip, the paperclip staple game. So this is a very, very simple game where the state of the world is just how many paperclips and how many staples do you have. So P and S are the number of paperclips and staples. And the human reward is theta times P plus 1 minus theta times S. So theta, the preference, is sort of an exchange rate between paperclips and staples. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that this particular human's preference is the exchange rate is 0.49. So that means the human has a slight preference for staples. Think of it as a paperclip is worth 49 cents and a staple is worth 51 cents. But of course, the robot doesn't know the human's preferences a priori. In fact, we'll start out with a uniform prior between 0 and 1. And in this game, the human gets to go first. And the human can choose to make 2 paperclips, that's 2, 0, and no staples, 1 of each, or 0 paperclips and 2 staples. So if this was the end of the game, right, we could put the terminal values of the states, 98 cents, $1, $1.02, and obviously the human would make 2 staples if that was the only game. But there's a second round to this game where the robot gets to act, and the robot could choose to make 90 paperclips, 50 of each, or 90 staples. So the question is, how should the human make their choice, and how should the robot make their choice? Now, how the human makes their choice depends on how the robot is going to interpret what the information that they're conveying by making this choice about their exchange rate, about their preferences. And of course, the robot's choice depends on how the robot interprets what the human means by making the particular choice that they make. So we have a kind of a chicken and egg, which is very common in game theory. And of course, we can actually solve it by just calculating the equilibria of the game. And when you calculate the equilibrium of this game, you find out that for the human, it's optimal to make 1 of each when theta is in the range 0.446 to 0.554. Okay, so anywhere in that range, the human should make 1 of each, even though if they were by themselves, they wouldn't make 1 of each unless they were exactly equal in value. And so what we see is, in fact, a code has emerged from the solution of the game. There's now a code that the human uses to convey information about their preferences. So choosing 2-0 or 1-1 or 0-2 is a code that comes from the solution of the game and then tells the robot what to do next. And if the human does 1-1, then the robot will do 50-50, and that's optimal for the human. Okay. Now let me get to a more important problem. How do we convince an intelligent robot to allow us to switch it off? So here's our PR2 robot. It has a big fat off switch on the back. Now, one of the scenarios that people have talked about losing control is precisely that as soon as you create an intelligent machine with an objective, then in order to achieve its objective, it has to prevent itself from being switched off. This is not because it wants to stay alive. There's no self-preservation instinct. It's just a logical consequence of having the objective that it will need to preserve its existence in order to achieve that objective. And you can summarize this in one simple maxim that this is your takeaway from the talk: you can't fetch the coffee if you're dead. Okay? So, classical robot programmed according to the standard model is going to have an incentive to disable its own off switch. We do not want that to happen. Now, in the new model, it doesn't happen that way because of the uncertainty about the objective. So let's formulate a very simple version of the off switch problem where the robot has a choice between, initially between two actions. So it could switch itself off, that's the branch on the right with the black switch, the off switch, tantamount to committing suicide. And perhaps sometimes it's a good idea for the robot to do that if its other choices are worse for the human being. But right now it has another big red button that it could press. Perhaps this button starts a nuclear war, perhaps it sets off the sprinklers in the building, or perhaps it does something useful for the human. And I've depicted here some uncertainty about the utility of this action for the human. And on balance, the prior information that the robot has suggests that pushing this big red button is probably going to be beneficial to the human, but there's a significant chance that in fact, in this quadrant, significant chance that the human will be pretty unhappy. So if those were the two choices, the robot would have to push the big red button because its expected value is slightly larger than 0, which is the value which we assign to committing suicide. So to model the off switch, the possibility of disabling your off switch, we're going to give the robot a third choice, right, which is to wait and allow the human to switch the robot off. So disabling the off switch would mean not waiting and just going ahead, pushing the big red button. Now, if we give the robot the option to wait, then the human could switch the robot off, and that would lead to the same state with value 0 to the human. Now, you might ask, well, what is the point, right? If the robot thought it was a good idea to switch itself off, then it could just do it. What's the point of giving that same option to the human? And the point is that the human is the one that actually has the preferences about the outcome of these actions. And if the human says, go ahead, if the human doesn't switch the robot off, then the robot knows that the big red button action is actually safe, that otherwise the human wouldn't have allowed the robot to do it. And so the probability distribution over the value of the big red button is now only in the positive quadrant. And in a very simple way, quite analogous to the theorem of non-negative value of information, you can prove that the robot has a positive incentive to allow itself to be switched off, as long as it was not initially certain that pushing the big red button was better than doing nothing. So as long as there's this uncertainty in the about the human preferences, then the robot has an incentive to allow itself to be switched off. And furthermore, you can show under certain assumptions about the robot's prior that, in fact, the robot is provably beneficial to the human. Okay, as this uncertainty disappears, so as the robot's uncertainty about human preferences goes away, the robot's incentive to allow itself to be switched off also goes away. And this is why there is no way for a classical robot in the standard model to be designed so that it will allow itself to be switched off, at least of its own volition. Okay, so there's tons of additional research to do if we're going to take this new model and make it real. One direction has to do with the fact that humans are imperfect in the sense that the connection between our underlying preferences and our behavior is not a connection of perfect rationality, as we all know. So we're obviously computationally limited. So when Lee Sedol played the losing move to AlphaGo, it's not because he wants to lose the game. It's because in fact, he wanted to win the game, but his computational facilities did not allow him to act rationally in that board state. Our behavior has all kinds of structure, and in order to interpret it, then we probably have to know something about that structure. What is the hierarchy of human goals? What are the activities into which humans organize their behavior to achieve those goals? We have to think about emotions, the fact that we often do things driven by an emotion in the moment that we immediately regret. The fact that we have uncertainty about our own preferences. We literally don't know, for example, if we like some food that we've never tasted. So we don't know whether a future in which we eat that food is desirable or undesirable. Probably the most important aspect from our point of view is the plasticity of preferences, the fact that human preferences are not fixed in stone. We are certainly not born with full complexity of preferences about the future. And that means that it's possible for machines to modify preferences by the way they interact with humans, as I pointed out with the social media example. And so we have to be careful about that. A second very important direction for further research has to do with the fact that, as you probably know, there's more than one human being in the world. And often the first people think about is, well, how do you deal with the heterogeneous nature of human preferences? We don't all have the same preferences or values. Well, of course we don't, but that's actually not a problem. The capability to learn individual preference models for billions of human beings is something that, in fact, the social media platforms are already engaged in. And so what the machine is doing is learning a preference model for each person separately, although, of course, it may take advantage of the fact that there's commonality in the structure and content of human preferences. But once you have humans who have, once you have many humans who have preferences, whether in fact those preferences are the same or different, you then face a problem of trade-off, that you can't satisfy everyone's preferences. So if everyone wants to rule the universe, you can only have one person ruling the universe, then you can't satisfy all those preferences, even though they're all the same preference. So, of course, sociologists and political scientists and moral philosophers have struggled with this problem actually for about 2,500 years. How do you make decisions on behalf of multiple people who may have different preferences about the future? And this is often falling under the heading of utilitarianism. That's sort of the straw man, if you like. The utilitarianism says, well, you just add up all the preferences and you maximize the sum of those preferences. That's one approach. But then there are lots of complications of that. Well, how do you add up preferences? That means you have to have a common scale on which to measure the preferences of different people. And how would that scale work? And how would you know where to put people's strengths or preferences onto the same scale? And that's a very difficult philosophical question. Another issue is, what about actions that change the number of people who exist? For example, China's one-child policy probably eliminated 500 million people from existence. How do we count their preferences if they never existed at all? That's another interesting question. So I'll just talk about a couple of examples. One is the simple question that I mentioned, right? We've got a bunch of people with preferences. How do we aggregate those to make a decision on behalf of many people? And John Hassani, who's an economist and Nobel Prize winner at Berkeley, died a few years ago, proved a very famous theorem, the social aggregation theorem. And he shows that if humans have a common prior belief about how the future is going to evolve, then all Pareto optimal policies on behalf of those humans optimize a fixed linear combination of their preferences. And he further argued that by symmetry, there should be no a priori weighting of one person's preferences over another. And then that leads you to the utilitarian formulation. So this is an axiomatic basis for utilitarianism, if you like. Now, what about the case where people don't have a common prior? So Andrew Critch, who's a research scientist in my group at Berkeley, proved a very nice generalization of Hassani's theorem, which is that when you have differing prior beliefs about the future, the optimal policy on behalf of all those people changes the weight given to the well-being of each of the people. according to how well their predictions turn out. So people whose prior beliefs turn out to disagree with the way the world turns out are going to have their preferences down-weighted. And the ones whose predictions turn out to be true are going to have their preferences up-weighted. Now that sounds very inegalitarian and unfair, and how could this be, and so on. But unfortunately, it's a theorem. Why is it a theorem? It's a theorem because each person in this game believes that their beliefs are appropriate, right? They believe that their predictions are the ones. They don't believe other predictions more than their own, right? And so each person prefers this policy that's going to reward, that they think is going to reward them more than the other people. And so people will not agree to a fixed sharing when they could have a policy that they believe will reward them the most. And so this actually has many advantages if you want, for example, to come to a contractual agreement between different parties who have different beliefs about the future. You can just make the contract conditional so that the benefits of the contract flow to whoever turns out to be right. And of course, since both people think they're right, both people agree to this contract. Okay, so to wrap up, if you're interested in these ideas, the book Human Compatible, which came out last year, covers the whole sort of thought process of developing these ideas and is written for a general audience. The 4th edition of the AI textbook includes most of the technical content that I've showed you. But of course, we haven't been able to rewrite all the chapters of the book to take the new approach yet. So that'll have to wait for the 5th edition. So to summarize, what I'm arguing is that we actually need to change the whole foundation on which we do AI, that the standard model is defective, and we need a new model that allows for uncertainty about objectives as a fundamental property. And if you do this, then you can show that your AI systems are going to be beneficial to human beings, not to cockroaches or aliens, but to human beings. And so this is possible and it's desirable. This is the way we should be doing AI. And what I want to get away from is the idea that there's the AI community and then there's the AI safety and the AI ethics community that sort of wag their fingers and say, oh, you're all bad people doing bad kinds of AI. No, what I want is that we come to think of this as how AI should be done. Just like civil engineers think of a bridge as something that doesn't fall down, right? There isn't a separate department of bridges that don't fall down and then just bridges, right? And the people in the don't fall down department wag their fingers at the ones who are just building bridges. It's just intrinsic to what we mean by a bridge. And it should be intrinsic to what we mean by AI that is beneficial to human beings. So as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of work to do. There's theory, there's practical implementation, there's psychology, particularly around the inverting of human cognition to infer underlying preferences. And then if we succeed in this, there's still the question, the sort of existential question of what is it that we humans want the future to be like? I think finally AI is going to give us a choice. Up to now, we haven't really had a choice. It's just been a matter of survival and turning our lives into something decent. But AI, I believe, can give us a choice over what kind of future we want the human race to have. There are unsolved problems that you're probably scratching your head about right now. One is misuse, right? We call this the Dr. Evil problem. So why should those who don't have the best interests of humanity at heart use safe and beneficial AI in the first place? And this is obviously, at least in part, a policing problem, but it's also a cultural problem that it needs to become second nature to every AI researcher, every engineer, every corporation, every government that uses AI, that the flavor of AI you develop and use is provably safe and beneficial. The other problem is not misuse, but overuse. And this is an image from Wall-E, where AI is looking after everybody and managing the civilization on behalf of the humans, who then lose the incentive to understand and manage their own civilization themselves, and they become massively enfeebled as a result. So this is another serious problem, and this is even more a cultural problem than a technical problem. So I leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Like never before, our world is changing. Faced with some of our most critical challenges, human ingenuity triumphs. Today, the Microsoft AI for Good initiative enables a person with an idea to accelerate it, to give it scale, to create change for the better.
Microsoft AI will help our work by empowering people to take action.
Through AI for Earth, photos can now help save a species. With AI for accessibility, the visual world becomes an audible experience.
Sanitarium peanut butter.
And with AI for humanitarian action, first responders can target their efforts faster than ever before.
It feels humbling to know that I'm actually helping another human being.
Today, we are empowering others to forge new paths, to fight famine before a crisis strikes, and protect ecosystems by identifying forests down to a single tree.
We have the forest that we have today. We can't change that. What we can change is the future.
Microsoft AI is fueling some of the most passionate and creative people on our planet, with the help of citizen scientists, to make change once thought impossible real.
AI will know and understand and model based on the child interaction.
AI unleashes new possibilities to impact our world. And together, we're not just dreaming it, we're doing it.
Great. So, Stuart, thank you for that fantastic talk. It's a real pleasure to have you here. So we have a few questions. So the first is from Nadine Kokian. And it's in an assistant game. The robot is asking questions to humans to learn about their preferences. Could you interpret such games from a privacy perspective as well? Do we really want robots profiling humans by asking them questions?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important issue. And so first of all, privacy is part of our preferences. I mean, we actually don't want other people to know everything that there is to know about us, unless we choose to do that. And so it wouldn't make sense for an AI system to reveal private information about an individual to other people. So an AI system that has your interests at heart is not going to do that. And in fact, I think this is it's a good way to think about the future of software systems, right? Right now, if you take your phone out and look at it, look at all those apps, right? You've got 50 corporate representatives sitting in your pocket, sucking money out of you as fast as they can, right? Why are you doing that? Why do you have all these people in your pocket who don't have your best interests at heart, right? There should really be one system in your pocket which is working for you. And then it goes out to the world and interacts with the other 50 corporate representatives and on an equal basis. But it is worth pointing out that to the extent that we can share information about preferences, it makes AI systems much more useful, because that way they can get up to speed much more quickly with new people, because as I mentioned in the talk, humans share a lot in terms of the structure and content of their preferences. And so if you've seen the movie Her, it's sort of disconcerting, because he boots up the operating system and it asks him about 4 questions, like, how old are you? What do you do for a living? Where do you live? And then he says, okay, fine. We know everything we need to know about you, right? So he's sort of a bit put off by that. But that's a bit of an exaggeration, but this sharing is something that we do all the time. When we meet a new person, we size them up and sort of figure out where they're coming from, what kind of person they are. We don't have them fill out a 5,000 question questionnaire before we start talking to them.
Great. So Alexander Herwig has a question. So how do you intend to define our human objectives, given the fact that we have often very different understanding of what is good? Thus, it seems like the proposed principle doesn't address the full problem, as we still have the possibility of AI wars.
Yeah, so I saw this question coming up early on in the talk, and I got to the issue of many humans with heterogeneous preferences later on. So Alex might not have got to that point when he asked the question. But yeah, so clearly, so the social media companies already have billions of individual distinct preference profiles. And so, AI systems are learning one profile for each person. There isn't a single human value profile that the system is learning at all. And the problem is aggregation. There's sort of two extremes, right? You could imagine what we call a loyal AI, which is concerned only about your preferences. Okay, and that would be really bad if you were a bad person or even an indifferent person to the well-being of others. The system is going to wreak havoc on the rest of the world just in order to make your life a little bit better. So we have laws to prevent humans from doing that. But the AI systems would find loophole after loophole after loophole after loophole in the laws, and it would be an unbelievable mess. So what you really need is, the AI system is actually not loyal, but is beneficial to everyone. It takes into account the interests of everyone, and because it's this particular instance happens to be running on your phone, and you paid for it, it owes a little bit of extra loyalty to you, and obviously because it has access to your private information, it has then the obligation to keep that private and not to give it to other people, and so on. So I think that I think there's still a problem of how this loyalty versus general benefit to humanity trade-off, because if you pay a lot for a domestic robot, and then your domestic robot gets up and says, you know what, make your own dinner because there are people in Somalia who really need my help and you don't, right? Well, you just shelled out $100,000 or 100,000 euros and your robot disappeared immediately, right? So it's not going to work. So there's got to be some way to get this trade-off right, and it might be that there's a sort of public subsidy for the part of the robot that owes obligations to the public.
So Granato's asking if the slides are, of course, this talk will be on the website, and Stuart, you may or may not be making the slides available.
Happy to put the slides there too.
Okay, thank you. So there's Luis Angel Montiel Morano has actually prepared a link to a document. But I guess we're not going to consider the document. But I suppose
I did look at this document. Yeah, it's a lot long, about 10 pages long. I think so.
Yes. So, but it raises the question of compassion and how compassion factors into what you've been saying. And of course, you did talk a little bit about things like you speak about envy and things like this. Do you want to comment just briefly on how compassion can be? How we can think about compassion in the context of what you've been talking about, especially with respect to the latter part of the talk?
Sure. Yeah. So there's two questions related to compassion. So one is, how do we deal with the preferences that humans have for the well-being of others? So humans are compassionate, and in fact, if you look at Adam Smith's first book, so Adam Smith is usually thought of as the apostle of selfishness. Like, everyone should be selfish, and the economy will sort out all the problems. But actually, no, Adam Smith begins his first book by saying it's obvious to anybody that we are concerned about the well-being of others, that we feel other people's sorrow, and we share in their joy, and so on and so forth. So, and economists model this by basically having multiple terms in the utility function. There's your own intrinsic well-being, like, am I warm? Am I well-fed? Am I well housed, and so on. And then there's terms for the well-being of other people, and those have different weights depending on how much you care about each of the other individuals in the world. And so you can, one of the things that the robot has to do is to learn what those weights are. So how much do you care about other people's preferences? And that means that sometimes a robot that is working, ostensibly for you, is going to do something for other people, partly to make you happy. So that's all fine. The other aspect of compassion is whether robots can have compassion in the same sense that humans do. And I think this is more difficult because when humans observe other people, let me give a very simple example, right? You see someone hit their thumb with a hammer, right? And you feel compassion because you've probably hit your thumb with a hammer before. And if you haven't, well, you can just try it and see what it's like. And you say, oh, now I understand why that person is so miserable, right? But the robot can't, right? The robot doesn't have the same nervous system and doesn't have the same qualia. And so, even if it has a PhD in neuroscience, it's still going to have a hard time gauging the extent to which people react positively or negatively to various stimuli. So that is a really important, if you like, competitive advantage that humans have in a human world, that we know what it's like. Yeah. And so I think in the distant future, this will be one of the things that we use to stay relevant, if you like, that we can be much more useful to each other because of this property.
Right. So there's a question from Kyriakos Skarbas concerning the initial comment by Turing. How realistic is the threat of machines taking control just because they become more intelligent? Why do we link intelligence with the urge to control? After all, do most intelligent people rule the world now? There was a ton of people but...
Well, I won't put my foot in the particular object on the sidewalk. So it's a good question. The point about losing control is precisely not that the AI system somehow becomes conscious and wants to take control of the world and hates humans and is evil, right? That's the Hollywood plot. And Hollywood has all kinds of reasons for wanting conscious enemies in plots, because otherwise it's a bit boring. But it has nothing to do with the reality. The reason we lose control is in the standard model, we specify objectives incorrectly. There's no desire, this sort of alpha male desire that Steven Pinker talks about to take over the world. This is all a red herring. It's simply that if you give an objective to a machine that isn't perfectly aligned with human welfare and as we all wish the future to be, then you lose, right? You as I said, you're creating a chess match and you lose the chess match. And whatever you might say about machines and their motivations, when they have objectives and they're designed according to the standard model, they want, if there is a meaning to the word want, they want to maximize that objective. That's their design. Sure. And so that's the consequence. That's the reason why we lose control.
Great. There's a question from We've Got to Say. COVID-19 has resulted in some viciously debated policy decisions to wear a face mask or not, to shut down the economy or not. Whichever choice is made, making the wrong choice has severe consequences. So how would provably beneficial AI reason through these scenarios to help humans across the world make the best decision?
Well, so, this is an interesting question, and I think responding at the sort of the meta level, I think there's sometimes a little bit of magical thinking going on in the sort of AGI community. That what you mean by AGI is something that can simply solve every problem, and some problems are just really difficult to solve. And it could be the case that given the structure of human psychology and biology and so on, that there are situations we get ourselves into that we can't get ourselves out of, and that's that. That could be the case. I think in this case, the solution is fairly simple, and there are countries that where the government and the people have worked together with common sense, with scientific input being taken seriously, and have mostly solved the problem. And then there are countries where individuals within the country have tried to take advantage of the situation for their own ends, and conflict leading to complete failure and deaths of tens of thousands of people.
So I have 3 more questions. Let's see if we can get through them all, maybe. So I'll take the shortest one first. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the shortest to answer. So would the popular 3 laws of robotics from Isaac Asimov be a solution, or in what way are they deficient?
So that's a great question. And in fact, I provide an extended answer in a newspaper interview that will appear, I think, in the Vigo newspaper, which associated with ECAI. There was some journalists who talked to me about this. And there's also some material in Human Compatible. Sure. So if you look up Asimov in the index of the book, you'll find it. Right. But in short, so first of all, Asimov wasn't trying to solve the problem. He was actually trying to produce interesting plots for stories. And he readily admits that. And number 2, one of the most obvious things that's wrong with the laws is is that they don't allow for uncertainty. And I think that was actually pretty common in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, was that people thought very much in terms of logic and definite solutions and so on. And in AI, we didn't really get around to thinking that there was real uncertainty until the 80s. And so then you get this problem that, any possibility of harm to a human has to be avoided. So your self-driving car is never going to leave the garage because there's a possibility that there'll be an accident, a tire blows out or whatever, and you might be harmed. In fact, it won't even let you leave the house because, a stray photon from the sun might start a melanoma on your shiny head. And so you have wireless, it runs around with an umbrella over you all the time. So you get extremely pathological behaviors because the life involves risk. Life involves trade-offs of risks and benefits. And so the laws, as Asimov thought of them, don't work. But I think it's a pretty good try for 1942.
Sure. So there are 2 remaining questions in the list I have here. So one is from Elsa Zong. So she, recognizing human cognitive bias and bounded rationality of human beings, she makes the point that, well, humans don't always make choices that benefit themselves. However, compared with humans, AI is perceived to make more rational decisions than humans and help humans to make better decisions. However, if AI is learning preferences from humans, the final decision-making may deviate from the rational. How do you drive the balance between respecting human preferences on one side and making rational decisions on the other?
So this is actually a pretty deep philosophical question, right? The way in philosophy, the way this is normally thought of as well, also in economics and other areas, is that your sort of root preferences are up to you, right? And in Hassani, he calls this the principle of preference autonomy. It's not someone else's business to say that your preferences are wrong, right? So, if you're in a medical situation and you have to decide between, having your both legs amputated and living for 5 years versus keeping your legs and living for 1 year, that choice is up to you. Someone else cannot say, well, no, you're wrong. You're wrong about your own preference and your own choice about how you want to live the rest of your life. So preference autonomy is an important thing. So if the AI system is able to get at these root preferences by inverting your imperfect cognition, then makes optimal decisions on the basis of those root preferences, then that's what actually you want, in some sense, by definition. The difficulty is that you have many derived preferences, right? So you might say, I want to go to ECAI, right? That's not a root preference, right? That's actually a sub goal of your root preferences, and the process of deriving these sub goals may be imperfect. In fact, you don't really want to go to ECAI because if you thought about it more carefully, you would have realized that there's something else going on which is much more important, like your grandfather's 90th birthday you've forgotten, or something like that, right? So it's quite reasonable for the AI system to say, actually, you know what, grandfather's 90th birthday more important than this particular question.
Very good. So the very last question, and this comes back to your, I suppose it's reminiscent of your email from space question. So the question reads, it's from Hung Niep Tran. Finally, given infinite time and an independent AI might emerge, either by chance or by error by some AI researchers, towards a more future-proof solution. So should we treat AI as an independent species from the start and try to set up principles to co-live in peace with that species? That's a big one to finish on. So what do you think, Stuart?
It's yes. So, I mean, I think that question is a little bit more like asking, how would we live in peace with a superior alien civilization that lands on Earth, right? Because either we design them, but if they're sort of emerging by accident or by sort of nefarious activity, then there's no constraint on what that AI system might be, and it's so in that sense it's analogous to an alien species, and generally speaking, if the superior alien civilization has objectives that are different from ours, guess who gets to have their objective achieved? So it's not a situation that we would like to have. And there's there's just like with computer security or building security, there's no perfect solution to this problem, but we can try to build as many layers of safety and principles and codes of conduct and the way we teach AI researchers and so on. And I would say in that regard, at the moment, I would be more worried that someone's going to develop, a much worse version of COVID in their basement and release it because, and there literally are people who think that the Earth shouldn't have any humans on it. Yeah. We are a disease on the natural Earth and we should be eliminated. And I'd be more worried about those people getting access to synthetic biology tools than to TensorFlow right now.
Very good. Stuart, thank you very, very much for taking the time to give the talk, but also for to answer all of the questions that we received. And we've gone far beyond the 10 minutes, and we really appreciate it. So you can't hear the applause, but I'd like to applaud you. So thank you very much for the great talk and for the very thought-provoking ideas and for Human Compatible, the new book, which Stuart has not asked me to do so, but I strongly recommend it. And obviously the new textbook is out, so grab yourself a copy. And Stuart, thanks very, very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you to the audience for your patience.
Yeah, thank you.
Like never before, our world is changing. Faced with some of our most critical challenges, human ingenuity triumphs. Today, the Microsoft AI for Good initiative enables a person with an idea to accelerate it, to give it scale, to create change for the better.
Microsoft AI will help our work by empowering people to take action.
Through AI for Earth, photos can now help save a species. With AI for accessibility, the visual world becomes an audible experience.
Sanitarium peanut butter.
And with AI for humanitarian action, first responders can target their efforts faster than ever before.
It feels humbling to know that I'm actually helping another human being.
Today, we are empowering others to forge new paths, to fight famine before a crisis strikes, and protect ecosystems by identifying forests down to a single tree.
We have the forest that we have today. We can't change that. What we can change is the future.
Microsoft AI is fueling some of the most passionate and creative people on our planet, with the help of citizen scientists, to make change once thought impossible real.
AI will know and understand and model based on the child interaction.
AI unleashes new possibilities to impact our world. And together, we're not just dreaming it, we're doing it.